You are 3 years into a sentence you will never finish. That is the first thing you need to understand. Not the crime, not the verdict, not the date the judge read from a piece of paper while you stood there with your hands still cuffed to a chain around your waist. The first thing you need to understand is the arithmetic. You are 3 years in. You are not getting out. And somewhere between the day they moved you to this unit and the morning you stopped counting days on the wall, you figured that out. Not all at once. Slowly, the way water figures out how to get through a wall. Patient, and without agenda, and completely unstoppable once it finds the first crack. Death row is not what you think it is. It is not a place of constant screaming. It is not what the movies gave you. It is closer to a library that nobody is ever allowed to leave. Quiet in a way that takes years to stop hearing. The fluorescent lights run 24 hours a day, every day, without exception. You learn to sleep inside the hum of them. You learn to tell time by meals and by the shift change and by the particular sound of a certain officer's boots on the tier. Not heavy boots, not deliberate. A dragging half-step on the left side, like an old injury that never fully closed. You learn that sound before you learn almost anything else. You learn it the way you once learned your mother's voice, without trying, without deciding to. It just enters you and stays. This is what it costs you at the beginning. You are in a single cell, 8 feet by 10, a steel toilet and sink bolted together into one cold unit. Because the concrete never holds warmth, it only borrows it and gives it back later when you no longer need it. A shelf, a mattress that remembers everyone who slept on it before you, shaped by their weight, holding the outline of people whose names you will never know. A small window that faces another wing of the building, so the light you get is second-hand, bounced off a surface that does not care about you in any direction. You have your personal property stored in 2 clear plastic bins. The bins have your number written on them in black marker. That number is your rank now, whether you have accepted that or not. You had a name in the other world. Here you have the name and the number. But the number is what matters to the institution. The number is what goes on every piece of paperwork. The number is what gets called at mail time, and you learn to stand up when it is called, before you even realize you have been doing it for weeks. The number is what a nurse reads off a clipboard before asking, in a flat and practiced voice, whether you are currently experiencing any suicidal ideation, which is a question they ask on a rotation, the same way they ask about blood pressure and medication compliance. You answer to the number before you realize you have started answering to it, and that is the first signal that something inside you has already begun to shift without asking your permission. Nothing announced it. One morning, you simply turned your head. The first stage of life on death row is administrative. Everything you can have, everything you can do, everything you can receive from the outside world, all of it runs through a process. You learn that process the way someone learns a second language in a place where not knowing it has real daily consequences. You learn which forms are used for visitation requests and which are used for property transactions. You learn that law library access is limited, scheduled in advance, and subject to cancellation for reasons that have nothing to do with the urgency of your legal situation. You learn that your incoming mail is read before it reaches your hands. You learn to write your own letters with that fact sitting in the room beside you, and you adjust the shape of what you say accordingly. You do not think of this as self-censorship at first. You think of it as practical. You think of it as adapting to the environment. That framing is your first small compromise, and you do not register it as a compromise because it costs you nothing you can feel yet. At this stage, you are still hoping. Not loudly. You figure out very quickly that hope, expressed openly, draws responses from the people around you that make it heavier to carry. Some of these men have been here longer than some of your most important relationships lasted. They have watched appeals get filed and denied with the patient, weathered recognition of people who have seen the same weather pattern too many times to be surprised by it anymore. They have watched dates get set, and then stayed, and then set again, for a later month. They have watched men leave this unit in 2 directions, and only one of those directions is upright, and only one of them ever comes back, and it is not the upright one. Your hope at this stage is private, small, folded carefully. You keep it in the same place you keep the letter from your mother that you have read so many times the paper is beginning to go soft at the creases. The second stage begins when you figure out the social architecture of the unit. Death row has a structure. It is entirely unofficial. Nobody explains it to you at intake or puts it in any document. But it exists as reliably as any other system that gets built by people who have no ability to leave and a great deal of time on their hands. There are men who have been here for a decade or longer who hold a kind of respect that has nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with accumulated knowledge. They know the things that actually matter inside this world. Which officer is worth trying to reason with on a difficult day? Which mental health appointment is worth formally requesting versus which ones are administrative formality with no real substance behind them? Whose attorney is actually working the case and whose has gone quiet? Who just received a date? Who is moving through something that looks like a breakdown? And what kind of space that person needs? And for roughly how long before they come back to themselves? You begin to understand that status here is measured in steadiness. The men who carry the most weight are not the loudest or the most dangerous. They are the ones who do not come apart, who maintain something that can honestly be called a routine, who read consistently, who use whatever limited exercise space is available every single morning regardless of mood, who answer their mail, who help the newer men understand the procedural world they have just entered. Steadiness functions as currency in here. When you produce it consistently, people begin to treat you differently. Officers speak to you in full sentences rather than directives. The caseworker holds eye contact when she says your number rather than looking past you. These are small dignities. You learn to count them because they are genuinely what is available to count, and counting them is better than measuring against everything else. You do not know yet what being steady is costing you, because what it costs you is the part of yourself that actually needed to fall apart, the grief you have been actively managing rather than allowing yourself to feel. The rage you have been converting into something usable, into procedural focus, into research, into the specific technical language of appellate filings and habeas corpus petitions. You are constructing a functional self on top of an unprocessed wound, and the structure is solid enough to serve you daily, but there is something underneath it that is receiving no light, no attention, no room to breathe. You will not feel this clearly for several more years. Right now, it simply feels like surviving. And in the early years, surviving feels close enough to winning that you do not think to question the difference between them. The third stage is when time changes its shape entirely. Everyone who writes honestly about extended incarceration eventually reaches for some kind of metaphor for time. And the metaphors are always different because the experience genuinely resists the language of a world that moves. It is not that time slows down in any simple way. It is that time stops having the texture it once had. In the outside world, time comes with events attached to it. Seasons that shift the quality of light in ways your body registers before your mind does. Holidays that carry emotional weight, even when you are actively ignoring them. Relationships that evolve gradually over weeks and months in ways you only recognize looking backward. Time inside stops having that kind of texture. The days become consistent in a way that eventually produces a smoothness, and the smoothness becomes a kind of white noise, and eventually you stop noticing it because there is nothing different pressing against it. You begin to lose certain memories. Not all at once, and not the ones you expected to lose first. You assumed the large things would soften. The courtroom, the sound of the verdict being read, the particular quality of silence in the room after. Instead, you start losing small things. The smell of a specific kitchen on a specific unremarkable afternoon. The exact timbre of a voice you loved. The physical sensation of an ordinary day. Its weight, its temperature, the way it moved around you without asking anything significant of you. These sensory details felt permanent because they were so immediate, so bodily. And they go out of focus the way photographs go when they have been left too long in direct sunlight. And what sharpens in their place is the unit. The drain in the corner of the floor. The fluorescent hum. The boots on the left side dragging slightly. This replacement is the most disorienting loss of everything because nobody names it, nobody documents it, and nobody gives it back. At this stage, Some men find religion. Not always as performance, though performance is sometimes part of it. As actual structural support for a self that is being required to exist inside conditions the self was never built for. You watch it happen around you without judgment, because you understand it as engineering. A person living here needs something that holds when the institution shifts its schedule, or denies a request, or changes a rule without notice. Something that does not depend on an appellate timeline or a caseworker's attention span. Something that belongs entirely to the person in a way that cannot be placed in a clear bin with a number written on it in black marker. You find your own version of this necessity or you do not. Either way, you understand the needed answers, because you feel that same need pressing on you, and you have been responding to it differently through discipline, through the maintenance of routine, through the letter you have been reading less frequently, because the ache it produces has started to feel like something you cannot afford. The fourth stage arrives without any announcement, which is how the most permanent changes always arrive. You stop tracking the legal calendar with the same intensity you once brought to it. Not because you have given up, and the distinction still matters to you enough that you hold on to it carefully, but because you have watched that calendar cycle through anticipation, and then revised anticipation, and then procedural continuance enough times, that the machinery of hope has worn itself down to something quieter and more durable. Your attorney calls. You listen carefully. You provide the correct information. You sign what requires signing. But there is something sitting between you and the proceedings now, a kind of transparent partition that was not present in year one. You are present for your own legal situation in a way that has begun to resemble paperwork, something being processed under a name that used to feel more completely like yours. This is when the actual cost becomes visible, finally, after years of accumulation. Not the cost of the sentence. That was announced in a courtroom and filed into a record, and it has never changed. The cost that surfaces now is the cost of your own successful adaptation, because you adapted well, genuinely and measurably well. You learned every process, you maintained your steadiness, you built something livable inside conditions that were designed without your livability as any part of the consideration. And what that construction cost you, the cost that never appeared on any form, that no one counted, that no institution was required to account for, is a specific and growing distance from your own interior life. A distance that began as necessary insulation and became, without any single decision being made, permanent, load-bearing architecture. You cannot feel certain things you used to feel with any ease, not because the capacity has been removed, but because the routes toward those feelings have been so long unused, so consistently rerouted around, that they have narrowed into passages you can no longer move through without a difficulty that makes the attempt feel like too much for an ordinary Tuesday. You know about those routes the way you know about a particular street in a neighborhood you grew up in. You remember it exactly. You could describe it to someone in real detail. You simply cannot get there from where you are standing now. The letter from your mother sits in the clear plastic bin. The paper is soft at the folds now, past the point where it will ever recover its original stiffness. You do not take it out as often as you once did. Not because your feeling for her has diminished, you know, with real certainty that it has not, but reading it used to generate a specific and locatable ache, and that ache used to connect you to something true about who you were before all of this began. And now when you hold it, what arrives is quieter, processed, a recording of a feeling, rather than the feeling in its original form. You notice this one morning when the tear is quiet, and the shift has turned, and the light is doing its second-hand thing through the window, at the angle it always does at this hour. And you sit with the letter in your hands, and you wait. You wait for what it used to bring. What comes instead is something closer to recognition than grief. You put it back in the bin. You sit with that for a while. That is the deepest cost of every rank on death row. Not the years that are gone, though they are gone completely, and that fact lives in you, like a stone placed carefully in the chest. Not the second-hand light, or the mattress that holds the shapes of other bodies, or the number that now comes to your lips before your name does in certain moments. The deepest cost is the unmeasured, undocumented, ungoverned distance between who you were when this started and what you have become through the long, ordinary work of surviving it. You did not lose yourself in any dramatic collapse. There was no single moment you can point to and say, there. It happened incrementally, procedurally, through 1,000 individual adjustments that were each evaluated separately, entirely reasonable, and that together added up to a version of yourself that functions inside this environment with a quiet and terrible efficiency. The fluorescent light runs 24 hours. You stopped hearing the hum years ago. That is the real measure of where you are. Not the calendar, not the filing dates, not the count of how many men you have watched leave this tier in the direction nobody talks about directly. The measure is the hum. When you first arrived, it pressed against the inside of your skull at night and kept you rigid and awake. You remember pressing your palms against your ears in the dark and feeling the sound move through the bones of your hands. Now you know it is there only because you remember being a person who heard it. The hum did not stop. You changed, slowly and without ceremony, until you fit around it. That is the confession underneath every other confession. You changed to fit around it, and the fit is close enough now that you cannot always locate the edges of yourself against the sound. You sleep fine now. Nobody tells you that before you come in. That the most devastating outcome is not falling apart. The most devastating outcome is the efficiency. The quiet, hard-won, entirely necessary efficiency of a person who learned to live in a place where living was never part of the design. You did not break. Some mornings that fact sits across from you in the 8x10, and it is the most difficult thing in the room. Not the sentence, not the bin, not the window that gives you someone else's light. The fact that you did not break, and the question that lives underneath that fact, the one with no deadline attached to it, no form that processes it, no attorney who can file on your behalf. What exactly did not break? And whether that remaining thing, that adapted and efficient and steadiness-producing thing, whether it is still enough in any honest accounting to be called you. If you have ever looked at someone who survived something that should have broken them and felt something more complicated than admiration, say it below. Because complicated is the only honest response to what survival at that cost actually looks like up close.